And for that, the Australian government wants to bring the economy to its knees. Say no to the carbon tax. This message is brought to you by the Galileo movement. Is brought to you by the No, this isn't a video about the carbon tax. Whether you re for it or against it is your business, not mine. What I'm interested in is this thing called the Galileo movement. Oh, Whenever a particular group wants to challenge established science, they like to compare themselves to Galileo, a lone voice crying out against the scientific consensus. Trouble is, Galileo was challenging the scientific consensus of the 17th century. He was the scientific consensus of the 17th century, which is why he's called the father of modern science. What he was challenging was belief and dogma, and the idea that just because authorities like the Pope or Aristotle believes something to be true, that doesn't make it true. What counts is evidence derived by the scientific method. But this begs the question, is there a consensus on whether CO2 affects global temperature? Citizen scientists can't seem to agree. Some say there isn't, or that we don't know whether there's a consensus or not. Nobody knows what the majority of scientists think. Well, let me attempt to break the tea. We don't know if there's a consensus on any scientific theory. Of course, if you feel the need to put a number on it, you could quite easily count the number of papers consistent with a certain theory, or the impact factors of the journals in which they republished, or the number of times they've been cited, or count up the position statements of scientific organizations. No one ever takes a vote to see how many scientists support any theory, whether it's climate change, evolution, or even whether the Earth orbits the Sun. So, if scientists never get to vote on them, how do we know that these theories are correct? And why do they end up being taught in schools and universities? To explain how this works, let's take a look at the theory of plate tectonics as an example. The theory didn't develop overnight because geologists voted for it. It started with evidence showing continuity of fossils and rock types between continents. And, of course, early on there were a lot of flaws in the theory and other hypotheses that explained the evidence that had been found. Then came the discovery of magnetic alignment in rocks, and oceanographers discovered magnetic striping. Each step, each discovery, and each conclusion was written down and published in peer-reviewed papers where the evidence could be checked and challenged or confirmed. As more and more evidence supported the hypothesis, fewer flaws were found, and therefore fewer rebuttal papers could find fault with it. The hypothesis became a theory not because everyone voted for it, but because the amount of evidence became so overwhelming that in the end no one could find any serious flaws. And no other hypothesis could explain the evidence. Every scientific theory goes through exactly the same process. Of course, there are always a few researchers who have a pet hypothesis that they stick to even if they can't produce any evidence to support it. What matters is not what these contrarians assert in blogs and interviews. What matters is the evidence they publish in scientific papers supporting those assertions. And if they don't have any evidence to publish, then railing against a hypothesis may sway public opinion, but it cuts no ice in the world of science. Quoting what experts say in television interviews or blogs or even congressional inquiries is called an argument from authority. That's why I always check to see whether any public statement is supported by a peer-reviewed paper published in a respected scientific journal. And if it is, then I quote that. The problem for contrarians is that most scientific theories are so well supported that it's hard to find any scientists who still disagree with them. So people from outside have to be trucked in and their credentials puffed up. Here, for example, are some familiar activists who don't accept that Kato is the long-term driver of climate, along with the funny titles they've been given. Ours, with the and here are their real fields of expertise. Does that matter? No, as long as their statements are backed by evidence they've published in peer-reviewed papers. But they re not. So quoting these goos is not only an argument from authority, it's worse. It's an argument from a phony authority. Of course, the methods used to attack paleoclimatology are exactly the same as the methods used to attack paleontology. Turn someone into an authority and then argue from that phony authority. Professor and science researcher Yan Jubai. If Yan Jubai has evidence that a particular type of dinosaur laid its eggs in a different manner, all he has to do is write a scientific paper on this astonishing discovery and submit it for publication. Idea to say if we look at climate through the geological time frame, we would never suspect Kato as a major climate driver. And instead of going on television and telling us Kato is not a long-term driver of climate change, why doesn't Ian Clark submit a response paper to all those researchers who've shown that it clearly is? After all, he's written hundreds of papers in his own field, which is geochemistry, but for some reason, not one single paper related to the effects of Kato on temperature. He can say whatever he likes on television, but again, that cuts no ice with science. And when I pointed out Bob Carter's lack of research in me video Meet the Scientists, I got this comment from Easy's on the forum. Potholer54, are you even aware of what someone who studies stratigraphic sequences does? Well, I know it's hard to believe, but I did actually go through 3 years of stratigraphy lectures when I studied geology. I admit I was asleep during half of them and hungover during the other half, but I did manage to pass me stratigraphy exam at the end of it. So I do have an inkling of what a stratigrapher does. And it's not the same as paleoclimatology. Also, lots of the underpinning data that goes into paleoclimatology studies comes from the past climate expressed through stratigraphy. Yes, it does. And in fact, we can see how Carter's work is important for paleoclimatology. I took one of the few papers I could find of his that related to past climate and checked the citations. It was cited by this paper. In other words, it was used, along with a lot of other research papers, to help build up a picture of the Pliocene climate. And that research paper was cited by this paper, which was then cited by this paper, which was cited by this paper, showing a link between glaciation in Greenland during the late Pliocene and a decline in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So as is right. Carter's work does indeed underpin data that goes into paleoclimatology studies. But unfortunately, it supports the correlation between COT2 and global temperature. If Carter disagrees, why hasn't he published a paper detailing the reasons for his disagreement? Of course, the answer is that writing a scientific paper isn't the same as writing an op-ed piece in the Daily Telegraph. They say the writing as the and as they alien they say them you can't just write, I'm on off the world stopped paleoclimatologists, and I say global warming stopped. So there. In a proper science paper, you have to explain what evidence you have that global warming stopped. And that's something Carter can't do. The other problem with publishing in a respected scientific journal is that your work is fact-checked. So while you can get away with describing yourself as one of the world's top paleoclimatologists in a book, you can't get away with it in a scientific paper just to make you seem more important. Of course, if you don't name your expert, you can give him any credentials you like. You can even pretend he has a publishing history without fear that anyone will be able to check. The governor's source has led June Sarpong to a small town on the outskirts of civilization. It's here that a global warming critic says he's hiding for his life. I admit, I'm worried. Once he get to the other side, I'm going to be out of cell phone range. I don't know if anyone's following me or what to expect. She finds a man who does not want to be seen or named. A climate scientist who's been at the top of his field since the 1970s when the concern was global cooling. Can you tell us why you were in Silhouette today for this interview? Well, because of the attacks on me personally. Now we got no idea who this mystery climatologist is. One person we know it definitely isn't is Professor Tim Ball. After all, the climatologist in hiding is described as a climate scientist who's been at the top of his field since the 1970s. And we know that Tim Ball is a retired geography professor. He did study climatology until the 1980s, and his only contribution to climatology research was 3 papers looking at the historical weather records of the Hudson's Bay Company, all of them now around 30 years old. So what do you think is causing global warming? The sun. There's absolutely no question. The sun is virtually ignored by the authorities and particularly the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Well, now we definitely know it's not Tim Ball because Tim Ball doesn't sound anything like that. They virtually ignore the sun as a factor of climate change. Well, that's funny. Excuse me a second. Tim. Hello. Tim. Is that you? I can see you. Yes, it is you, Tim. Now, I'm sure conspiracy theorists tell me I'm endangering Tim Ball's life by exposing the identity of the mystery shadow man. Well, if Ball really was in fear of his life, It's odd that he's appeared on television programs and given public speeches and plastered his photo on website blogs many times since the conspiracy show was broadcast in 2009. He doesn't seem that concerned. Can you tell us why you in silhouette today for this interview? Well, that's a very good question. June. Could it be that your producers didn't think the conspiracy show would be much of a conspiracy show if it didn't have people hiding in the darkness because of a conspiracy against them and interviewers being scared that they re-followed to the outskirts of civilization, in other words, Canada, where Timball lives? Could it be that disguising him means that we have to take your word that we re-listening to a climate scientist who's been at the top of his field since the 1970s rather than a retired geography professor who's never published any papers in the field he's pontificating about? Could that be the reason? Sounds like a familiar tactic from those whose beliefs clash with scientific conclusions. I am having the pleasure of sitting down with a geophysicist that unfortunately has to remain anonymous. So, can I call you Steve? My name's Glades. All right, so Steve is going to share with us. No, just Steve. Let me ask you, as a geophysicist still, Timball is one of the few climate activists who's actually studied climatology. And that prompted this post from Straight Forever on me Meet the Scientist video forum. I study geography, and within the geography department where I study, there are people there who study different fields within geography, climatology being one of them. This person is therefore a climatologist and not a geography lecturer professor. Sorry to disagree back, but Timball was a geography professor and even describes himself as a geography professor when he's writing to people who can separate academic truth from bullshit. He only describes himself as a climatology professor when he's trying to impress politicians and members of the public who don't know any better. As I showed in the video, there is no department of climatology at the University of Winnipeg, but even if you still want to insist he's an expert, the same rule applies to all the other experts. They can't just make pronouncements on Ball has. And if you still want to insist he's an expert, then let's test that by seeing how much he actually knows. We'll start with this. I started in 1968, and at that time global cooling was the consensus. Now there are people out there that have tried to say, oh, it wasn't the consensus. Well, I can tell you it was. I was not only in it, I was teaching it and researching it as well. Hang on a second, what date was that? In 1968. 1968. But according to your own BO, you weren't teaching it. You were a search and rescue operations officer at that time, and you didn't you do your doctorate in climatology until the 1980s. So what evidence do you have that there was a consensus on global cooling except for a faulty memory? If Ball had taken the time to read papers that predicted future temperature trends in the 1960s and 70s, he'd find that 44 predicted warming and 7 predicted cooling. Ball also seems to be confused about what his supposed area of expertise is called. They started with global warming, and then when they realized that the global temperature was going down since 2000, even though CO2 continued to rise, and they started talking about climate change, which makes me wonder whether he's read any climate science papers in the last 25 years. Not only was this phenomenon called climatic change as far back as the 1950s, we even have something called the IPS, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, set up in the 1980s. Global warming is a colloquial term meaning exactly what it says, the overall warming of the Earth. Climate change is the change in climate that results from that warming. And then we come to this. For example, they virtually ignore the sun as a factor of climate change. Now, anyone who reads scientific journals that deal with climate science will be well aware of the huge amount of research that's gone into the role of the sun in warming. Even I've read these papers, Tim, and I'm not a climate scientist. What goes for Tim Ball goes for every other phony expert who eschews scientific research in favor of interview, newspaper opinion, and amateur dramatism. If there really were hundreds of climate scientists who disagree that CO2 is a long-term driver of climate, where are they? How come programs and congressional inquiries can't find them and have to resort to using people who've never published any research in this field and then make up phony titles for them? And more to the point, where are their papers? Even the busiest armchair scientists who deluge me channel with links can't find them. So thanks for all the links to blogs, videos, and data, and the occasional scientific paper showing facts that no one is disputing. And thanks for letting me know that there were unknowns in climatology and biology just as there were unknowns in any scientific field. That's why we do research. Was the medieval warm period global? Is atmospheric heat being taken up in the deep oceans? What's the contribution of epigenetics to evolution? How did giraffes evolve? Why are there hotspots in the mantle? What's the relationship between currents in the mantle and continental drift? Those who want to undermine scientific theories love to focus on the questions and the unknowns to imply that if we don't to know some things, then we can't know anything. But they never tackle the evidence that gave us these theories in the first place, because that evidence is as solid as it gets. If you are interested in having a go, I've outlined the evidence for the CO2 temperature link in me video, the evidence for climate change without computer models or the EPIPS. And I've outlined the evidence for evolution in me videos natural selection made easy and the theory of evolution made easy. So check the papers site and see if you can find response papers or any papers published in respected scientific journals that find fault with them. See if you can Simply listing names and appealing to authority, let alone a funny authority, is not how science is done. Before Galileo came along, this kind of argument from authority might have worked. But thanks to him and other pioneers of science, we've learnt that what counts is not dogma or the assertions of experts or the assertions of people who pretend to be experts. What matters is evidence that's peer-reviewed and published so it can be examined, tested, replicated, fact-checked, and faulted. That, after all, is what Galileo would do. It's the nearest thing we have to knowing what the consensus is in science.